Let's get you up to speed quickly. This fight started when Mr. Woodward appeared on Fox News Sunday almost 2 weeks ago, challenging the administration's narrative on these budget negotiations to head off the automatic spending changes. You know, they're going to decrease the amount of increased spending we're going to have, and this has caused all sorts of consternation in Washington. While the White House has repeatedly insisted that Republicans were to blame for that plan entirely, Mr. Woodward pointed out that this idea, in fact, originated with the president and his team. Keep in mind, President Obama had said specifically in a debate with Mitt Romney, the Republicans came up with this. Well, Woodward came out and said that's absolutely false. When I was researching my book months ago with an all-access pass to the White House, it was confirmed by many sources that this was the White House's brainchild. And now Jay Carney, White House spokesman, has since admitted that piece of it. Well, despite that reporting, the administration continued its charge against Woodward. It issued dire warnings about the toll that all of this sequestration, as it's known, would take on our economy, and blaming Republicans again for this every step of the way. They voted for it too, by the way. Then yesterday, Bob Woodward again made waves, calling the president's decision not to deploy an aircraft carrier due to the so-called cuts a kind of madness. This is Woodward criticizing the White House again. Hours later, more fuel on the fire when Mr. Woodward accused the White House of threatening him for challenging the president's version of events. Here he is on CNN.
Well, they're not happy at all, and some people kind of, said, look, we don't see eye to eye on this. They never really said, though, afterwards they've said that this is factually wrong, and it was said to me in an email by a top...
What was said, yeah.
It was said very clearly, you will regret doing this. I mean, it makes me very uncomfortable to have the White House telling reporters, you're going to regret doing something that you believe in.
Well, the White House has since denied that any threat was ever made, arguing Woodward misinterpreted that email, and on it goes. Chris Direwalt is our Fox News digital politics editor and host of Power Play on FoxNews.com Live. And now we know, Chris, who the man was who allegedly threatened Bob Woodward. Gene Sterling is his name. He's a economic policy advisor at the White House.
Gene Sperling. He's the head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and he has been out front and center for the president during this whole fight over the automatic decreases to automatic increases in spending. He's been the point man.
Okay, and so the White House, in response to Woodward saying he was threatened, releases the entire email. Well, not necessarily the entire. I don't know if it's the entire, but releases the email in which the alleged threat was made. And so now we have it, and it's amazing to see the folks rushing to defend the White House, and by the folks I mean the press, rushing to defend the White House. But I will say this is how the letter reads in part, the email from Gene Sperling to Bob Woodward dated February 22. I'm reading from Politico. I apologize for raising my voice in our conversation today. I know you may not believe this, but as a friend, I think you will regret staking out that claim, suggesting that the president had moved the goalposts in this whole negotiation. He says, not to argue and argue on, he said, but just my sincere advice. It's your call, obviously. My apologies again for raising my voice on the call with you. Feel bad about that and truly apologize. Gene. And then Woodward writes back, Chris, in the White House's defense, Woodward writes back and says, you do not ever have to apologize to me. You get wound up because you're making your points and you believe in them. And then he goes on to say, I welcome your personal advice. I am listening. So they are ticked off at the White House that he went out and said they threatened him. He and others who have covered the White House seem to believe, though, that this is a pattern of behavior by those at the White House.
Oh, my gosh. Well, yes, of course it is. There's a news channel. You may have heard of it, the Fox News Channel.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty big deal. Early in the president's administration, they tried to read us out of the press corps. They went on a deliberate, explicit campaign that the president, by the way, keeps up to this day, to try to cull us from the press herd and make sure that we are delegitimized in some way. They have done this to reporters from the Washington Examiner. They have done this to reporters from San Francisco Chronicle, Boston Herald. This is a pattern that this White House is engaged in. Now, Mr. Woodward, who has been sort of the Billy Graham of Washington journalists, the counsel to each president since Gerald Ford, ever since he took down Richard Nixon, every president has granted him access. He's been the guy.
Better to have him on your side.
Right, better to have him on your side. So what he considers a threat after getting a lot of kid glove treatment for 30 years is probably different. I would feel bad for him if he saw what was in the inboxes of some White House reporters that was far less gentle in its reproof than Mr. Sterling offered.
He, today, in the wake of all this, Lanny Davis, who is a Fox News contributor who sometimes writes for the Washington Times, comes out and says, I have been threatened by this White House, too, to the point where I called up the White House and said, you better never let this happen again. It's inappropriate. Then you've got Ron Fournier over at the National Journal. He was the editor-in-chief over there, and now he's back to his daily reporting, saying he's been abused by the White House, intimidation tactics, he says. He talks about how been subjected to vulgarity, abusive language, and virtually the same phrases that Woodward says were used against him about, you're going to regret this, talking about the badgering and saying it got to the point just now where he cut off his own senior White House administration official source because he said, I just disapprove of the way they deal with reporters, and I'm a seasoned reporter, but a younger reporter might be intimidated by them, and on principle, I'm shutting them down.
The president's operation is notoriously a boys' club, and that locker room attitude, that bullying way that they have. I mean, my gosh, David Plouffe, who is a very high-ranking official, a senior advisor to the president, my gosh, out basically taunting Woodward, calling him old, more or less, and saying he, like an old baseball player, can't hit the young pitchers of today.
Let's put it up. Let's put it up so they know what you're talking about. So David Plouffe tweets out the following. Watching Woodward the last 2 days is like imagining my idol, Mike Schmidt, who is some baseball players you point out.
Philadelphia Philly. He was very good.
Thank you. Facing live pitching again. Perfection gained once is rarely repeated. Go ahead.
Mean. Just mean. And this is something that people aren't used to. Certainly Bob Woodward's not used to that kind of treatment. The people in the White House press corps aren't used to that treatment. But guess what? Team Obama doesn't care. Woodward and company believe that the president wants to do a deal, or the president wants to have a good relationship with the press. He does not seem to want to do a deal with Republicans on spending, and he does not seem to want a good relationship with the press, and they're just going to have to lump it like we've been doing for the last 5 years.
Yeah, welcome to our world.
Exactly. Welcome aboard.
All right, Chris. Thank you.
You bet.
Well, while the White House denies any attempt to silence Woodward, administration media allies on the left have spent the last 24 hours beating up on a man who helped inspire thousands of journalism careers. Take a look at some of the headlines. The Huffington Post. Drama king. Woodward cries foul, runs to Hannity. And the reason they have that up there is because Bob Woodward, prior to any of the events that happened yesterday, had agreed to an interview with our own Sean Hannity. And he's been on CNN, and he sat down with Politico. They're trying to make it sound like he's running to, a conservative guy for an interview. This was long scheduled, and he's sat down with several media outlets in any event. Let's move on. And he's going to be on tonight, so tune in tonight at 9 p.m. In Slate, the headline reads, Woodward goes wingnut. Wingnut. The Nation reads, quote, from legend to laughingstock. Bob Woodward cites bogus threat, calls Obama Nixonian. All this has some people even making comparisons between President Obama and former President Richard Nixon when it comes to relationship with the media. I mentioned the National Journal reporter. He did that, and he says this is the reason that senior White House source gave him such a hard time and used the vulgar language and so on and so forth, to the point where the reporter cut off his own relationship with the White House. Sick of the abuse, he says. In our next hour, we will ask former President George W. Bush's White House press secretary, a woman you know by the name of Dana Perino, about what is going on here between the White House and its relationship with the press, and whether they have gone too far, whether this has been taken a step too far. Don't miss that.